And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth.
Now, I've seen Ben Shapiro kind of get stumped before, maybe like 2 or 3 times. I think it was the Monk debate or maybe Cambridge. But either way, this one it's not so much as him being stumped as you can tell how he has a veil over his spirit. Jesus hasn't revealed, I think he will. Jesus hasn't revealed that he's Messiah yet. There's a block right here that Ben can't get past. And Dr. Craig actually kind of exposes that. And, no offense to Ben Shapiro, I'll put links to all their stuff below so you can watch this. But you can tell it's pretty evident. And Dr. Craig does an amazing job kind of laying out the case for it. So check it out.
In the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy, it's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel.
You should go check out 1 Corinthians and look at the part where Paul says this information was passed on to me. Jesus died, he rose. Like when they go into the original, the way it's formatted, it's almost like meter for poetry. It's like da 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 da. The way oral tradition went, the way it was passed down. It's I think Gary Habermas, I think he was saying it can be dated within 6 months of the cross. That's insane. Like when I first saw it, I thought it was hundreds of years later this stuff was recorded and written down. We're talking about days after the cross. People were like, oh my gosh, da 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 da, saying this stuff till Paul eventually wrote it down. It's crazy.
Revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great, independently established facts.
This is awesome. Gary Habermas does something called the minimal facts debate. I'll put a link to it, but it's what basically everyone agrees on these facts. And he says that you can put together Christianity, everything without the Gospels, simply based on these minimal facts. Put it all together. So it's very cool. I'll put a link to it.
And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three.
I won't keep interrupting, I promise. But this number three, this is what got me this experiential relevance. It's the first kind of light bulb that just went off. And I was like, oh man, there's something to this. That these guys overnight could drastically go from being afraid to being the boldest people alive. So check this out.
That the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
Boom. Wow. So, I've been thinking more about this too. It's incredible, that people can't connect, that some people can't connect. I mean, there was, 39 books in the Old Testament, all pointing to Messiah. And you have so many prophecies. I mean, Isaiah 9, obviously Isaiah 53, all those. But I mean, I was reading, and it's like to us, a child will be born, a king, the government will be on his shoulders. And then you jump over to pierce for our transgressions. Everything is pointed, so much so Melchizedek, the Prince of Peace. It says in Isaiah 9 that Jesus will be called the Prince of Peace. Melchizedek was the prince or the priest of Salem, and Shalom, peace, Jerusalem. So Melchizedek in Genesis was, an archetype of Christ. He even gave him 10% tithing before the Levitical priesthood even existed. So everything points to Jesus as Messiah. And what Dr. Craig does is, again, lays out the case perfectly that not only is the Judeo-Christian God correct, but Jesus Christ and his testimonies about who he was, it's the only worldview that can be forensically kind of traced back, proven by evidence, whether it's testimony, different antiquities or writings, different stuff that we can historically match and verify. It's the only worldview, if you think about it, that can be done to, because everything banks on the resurrection, one event. If the resurrection weren't true, like Paul said, we'd all be foolish for believing this. But that resurrection right there, this event in history, we can focus in on it and see if it's valid, see if it's true. I mean, you're talking about over 500 people. I mean, Paul was saying, he's like, look, if you don't believe me, go ask 500 and some people. They all saw him too. And most of them, or many of them, are still alive. Like, go ask them. How would this message, this gospel, how would it have spread like wildfire, that massive, if there were over 500 people that could have just been like, that's not true. And it couldn't have been a hallucination, because hallucinations are individual experiences. So, and he had to have died on the cross, not the swoon theory or the switching the bodies out even. I mean, excruciating. It was designed to kill. No one could survive off being crucified. So what I'm saying is that when it comes down to it, you can get to where you, in essence, when I say prove, I mean logically, to where, you can rationally say, okay, this is the Occam's razor, the least assumptions, the most probable answer. But you can do it to the Judeo-Christian God, monotheism, Judeo-Christian God, to Jesus Christ being Messiah, based on everything he said, being accurate. And the crazy thing is that the biggest fear, the biggest ultimate consequence of sin is death. Death is sin. And it's the kind of intrinsic foundational root of fear is death, from the beginning of time. So, or human kind. So if you think about it, Jesus, he died and then he came back. He conquered that entire fear. And he's like, look, boom, it's done. This is what happens when you die if you believe. And it alleviates that entire fear, that entire consequence of sin. It's incredible what he did. But yeah, I think one day Ben will come around to it in terms of having that veil lifted. So thank you so much. God bless. Keep watching.